Hi there. It's been a while. Going to start reading articles again. This one is from Mike Meier from Willswing, and it's titled, Why Can't We Get a Handle on This Safety Thing? This article appeared in the September 1998 issue of Hang Gliding magazine. 20 years ago, and the same stuff is still happening. If I were to ask you to characterize the view that the uninformed public has of hang gliding, what might you say? You might say that they think of hang gliding as a death sport, or at the very least, an unreasonably unsafe activity. You might say that they think hang glider pilots are all thrill seekers who recklessly disregard the inherent risks in what they do. You might say that they are under the mistaken impression that hang gliders are fragile, unstable flying contraptions blown about by the winds and only partially and inadequately under control of the occupant. If confronted by this attitude in a spectator, how might you respond? You might say that once upon a time in the very early days of the sport, it was true that the gliders were dangerous and pilots behaved in an unsafe manner. You might point out that in recent years, however, the quality of the equipment, the quality of training, and the level of maturity of the pilots have all improved immeasurably. You might point to the fine aerodynamic qualities of today's hang gliders, the rigorous certification programs in place for gliders, instructors, and pilots, and you might give examples of the respectable occupations of many hang glider pilots: doctors, lawyers, computer programmers. You might make the claim that hang gliding today is one of the safer forms of aviation and is no more risky than many other action-oriented sports. Later on, you might laugh about the ignorant attitude of the woofo, or you might wonder, why is it after all these years that the public still doesn't understand? Why can't we educate them about hang gliding is really like and how safe and reasonable it really is? So now let me ask you another question. What if they are right? What if they're right and we're wrong? And what if I can prove it to you? Let's take a look. First of all, you have to admit that year after year, we continue to kill ourselves at a pretty depressing rate. Anybody that's been around this sport for very long has probably lost at least one friend or acquaintance to a fatal hang gliding accident. Most of us who have been around for more than 20 years have lost more than we care to think about. It's true that we have seemingly made some improvements in the overall numbers in the last 25 years. Between 1974 and 1979, we averaged 31 fatalities a year. Since 1982, we've averaged about 10 per year. In the last 6 or 8 years, we may have dropped that to 7 per year. On the other hand, what has happened to the denominator in the equation? In 1978, there were 16 manufacturers viable enough to send teams to the manufacturers competition in Telluride. Today, we don't even have a manufacturers competition. My guess is that the fatality rate hasn't changed much and almost certainly hasn't improved in the last 10 years. I'd guess it's about 1 per 1,000 per year, which is what I guessed it was about 10 years ago. So the question is why? The equipment gets better and more high-tech every year. We know more about teaching than ever. We've got parachutes, rockets to deploy them, full-face Kevlar helmets, wheels, FM radios for emergency rescue. We're all about 20 years older and commensurately wiser and more conservative. How come we're not safer? I've been asking myself variations of this question for as long as I can remember. 3 years ago, I had an accident, and thinking about that accident, I thought that maybe I'd stumbled onto some little insight into the answer. I'll share it with you. Here's the story. If you don't like reading there I was stories or other people's confessional accident reports, skip this part. I won't be offended. We were out doing some production test flying at Marshall Peak in San Bernardino. For those of you who haven't flown there, Marshall is a rounded knob in the middle of a 2,200-foot tall ridge in the foothills along the northern border of the east end of the Los Angeles basin. It's a very reliable flying site, probably flyable 300 days a year and soarable on most of it. It was July, in the middle of the day, but the conditions were not particularly strong. We were landing on top, which we do whenever conditions are not too rowdy, because it vastly enhances efficiency. I was flying a Spectrum 165 and setting up my approach. I've logged about 100 top landings a year at Marshall for each of the last 15 years. Even so, I know for a fact that at the time I was not complacent. I know because I have a clear memory of what I was thinking as I set up my approach. In 2 weeks, I was due to leave on a 3 week family vacation abroad and was thinking, you damn well better not get yourself hurt before your trip or your wife is going to kill you. At the same time, I wasn't anxious. I was flying a Spectrum. The conditions were only moderate. I'd made lots of successful landings on more difficult gliders in more challenging conditions. I hadn't had an unsuccessful landing attempt in longer than I could remember. I was relaxed, yet focused. My intent was simply to fly a perfect approach. Such intent is always a good idea when top landing, Marshall. The landing is challenging, and a sloppy approach can quickly get you into trouble. I knew exactly where I wanted to be at every point in the approach: position, heading, altitude, and airspeed. I executed the approach exactly as I wanted to. You top land at Marshall half crosswind, gliding up the backside of the hill. You come in hot because the gradient can be extreme, and there's often some degree of turbulence. The time interval from a 40-mile-per-hour dive through round out to flare is very short. I was halfway through this interval, past the point where one is normally rocked by whatever turbulence is present, when both my left wing and the nose dropped suddenly and severely. I went immediately to full opposite roll control and managed to get the wings and nose just level when the base tube hit. Having turned 90 degrees, I was traveling mostly downwind at a ground speed of probably 30 miles per hour. The right down tube collapsed immediately, and the right side of my face and body hit the ground hard. Very briefly, I thought I might die. For a slightly longer time, I thought about paralysis. Within a minute, I knew I was mostly okay. In the end, I got away with a slightly sprained ankle and a moderate case of whiplash. I had 3 weeks to think about the accident while I bounced around the rutted dirt roads of East Africa, trying in vain to keep my head balanced directly over my spine to moderate the pain. The thing was, I never considered at the time of the landing that I was anywhere near pushing the envelope. I've done dozens of landings at Marshall where I did feel that way. All during the previous 2 summers, I had been top landing ram airs at Marshall in the middle of the day in much stronger conditions. I had never had a crash. Thinking about it, I couldn't even remember the last time I had broken a down tube. I tried in vain to think of a clue that what I had missed, that this was going to be a dangerous landing. Finally, I was left with only one conclusion. What happened to me was nothing more or less than exactly what the potential result was during any of the times I had landed under similar or more challenging circumstances. That was a dangerous landing because of what could and have and did happen. The corollary, of course, is that all the other landings I had done on more challenging gliders in more challenging conditions were also dangerous. In fact, they were more dangerous. And they were so in spite of the fact that no bad results ensued in any of those landings. And suddenly I felt like I was beginning to understand something that I hadn't previously understood. You see, here's how I think it works. The overriding detriment of pilot safety in hang gliding is the quality of pilot decision making. Skill level, experience, quality of equipment, all those things are not determinants. What those things does determine one's upper limits. More skill gives you a higher limit, as does more experience or better equipment. But safety is not a function of how high your limits are, but rather of how well you stay within those limits. And that is determined by one thing, the quality of the decisions you make. And how good do those decisions have to be? Simply put, they have to be just about perfect. Consider the type of decisions you have to make when you fly. Do I fly today? Do I start my launch run at this time in this cycle? Do I have room to turn back at the hill in this thermal? Can I continue to fall this thermal back as the wind increases and still make it back over the ridge? Each time you face such a decision, there is a level of uncertainty about how the conditions will unfold. If you make the go decision when you're 99% sure you can make it, you'll be wrong on average once every 100 decisions. At 99.9%, you'll still be wrong once every 1,000 decisions. You probably make 50 important decisions for every hour of airtime, so 1,000 decisions comes every 20 hours, or about once or twice a year for the average pilot. So, to be safe, you have to operate at a more than 99.9% certainty. But in reality, 99.9% is virtually impossible to distinguish from 100%, So, really, for all intents and purposes, you have to be 100% sure to be safe. And now I think we can begin to understand the problem. Let's first consider this. We all have a strong incentive to make the go decision. The go decision means I launch now, relieve my impatience to get in the air, and avoid the annoyance of the pilots waiting behind me. Instead of waiting for the next cycle because the wind is a little cross and the glider doesn't quite feel balanced. It means I turn back in this thermal and climb out above launch and stay up instead of taking the conservative choice and risk sinking below the top and maybe losing it all the way to the LZ. It means I choose to fly today, even though the conditions are beyond my previous experience, rather than face listening to the there I was story of my friends in the LZ at the end of the day, knowing that I could have flown but didn't, and knowing that they did and were rewarded with enjoyable soaring flights. So the incentive is there to choose go. The only thing we have to counter this incentive is a healthy respect for the possible dangers of failure and our ability to evaluate our prospects for success. And here's where we get caught up by a mathematical trap. Let's say I'm making my decisions at the 99% level, and so are all my friends. Out of every 100 decisions, 99 do not result in any negative consequence. Even if they're bad decisions, nothing bad happens. Since nothing bad happens, I think they're good decisions. And this applies not to just my decisions, but to my friends' decisions as well, which I observe. They must be good decisions. They worked out, didn't they? The next natural consequence of this is that I lower my decision threshold a little. Now I'm making decisions at the 98% level, and still they're working out. The longer this goes on, the more I'm being reinforced for making bad decisions, and the more likely I am to make them. Eventually, the statistics catch up with me, and my descending threshold collides with the increasing number of opportunities I've created through bad decisions. Something goes wrong. I blow a launch or landing, or get blown over the back, or hit the hill on the downwind side of the thermal. If I'm lucky, it's a $50 down tube or a $200 leading edge. If I'm unlucky, I'm dead. If we can agree at this point that making 100% decisions is the only safe way to fly, then it becomes interesting to consider, as an aside, what the sport of hang gliding would look like if we all operated that way. Pilots would choose to fly in milder, safer weather conditions. They would operate much more comfortably within their skill and experience limitations. They would choose to fly more docile, more stable, easier to fly gliders. Landings would be gentle and under control. Hang glider manufacturers would sell 2 down tubes and 1 keel for every glider they build, the ones that come on the glider, instead of 3 or 4 replacement sets like they do now. There would be far, far fewer accidents. As it is now, there are about 200 per year reported to USHPA. There wouldn't be any fatalities, except maybe for one every couple of years if a pilot happened to die of a heart attack while flying. It's happened once so far that I can remember. Since this isn't anything like what the sport of hang gliding does look like, we might conclude that hang gliding, as is presently practiced, is an unreasonably unsafe activity practiced by people who lack a proper and reasonable regard for their personal safety. In other words, we might conclude that the uninformed public has been right about hang gliding all along. If you don't like that conclusion, I'm pretty sure you're not going to like any of the coming ones either. But let's first ask this question. If we wanted to address this problem of bad decisions being reinforced because they look like good decisions, how would we do it? The answer is we need to become more critically analytical of all of our flying decisions, both before and after the fact. We need to find a way to identify those bad decisions that didn't result in any bad result. Let's take an example. You're thermaling at your local site on a somewhat windy day. The thermals weaken with altitude and the wind grows stronger. You need to make sure you can always glide back to the front of the ridge after drifting back with the thermal. You make a decision ahead of time that you always get back to the ridge above some minimum altitude above the ridge top, say 800 feet. You monitor your drift and the glide back to the ridge and leave the thermal when you think in order to make your goal. If you came back in at 1,000 AGL, you made a good decision. If you come back in at 400, you made a bad decision. The bad decision didn't cost you because you built in a good margin, but it's important that you recognize it as a bad decision. Without having gone through both the before and after analysis of the decision, setting the 800-foot limit, observing the 400-foot result, you would never be aware of the existence of a bad decision or the need to improve your decision-making process. This was one of the main ideas behind the Safe Pilot Award. The idea wasn't to say that you had never crashed hard enough to need a doctor or you were a safe pilot. The idea was to get pilots thinking about the quality of their decisions. Not just, did I get hurt on that flight, but could I have gotten hurt? During the first couple of years of the Safe Pilot Award program, I got a few calls and letters from pilots who would tell me about an incident they'd had and ask for my opinion as to whether it should be cause for them to restart their count of consecutive safe flights. I would give them my opinion, but always point out in the end that it didn't matter. What was important was that they were actively thinking about how dangerous the incident had really been, i.e., what was the actual quality of their decision making. Looking back on it now, I would say that the criteria for a safe flight, any flight which didn't involve an injury indicating the need for treatment by a licensed medical professional, was too lenient. Today, I would say it shouldn't count as a safe flight if, for example, you broke a down tube. A few years ago, or maybe it was 10 or 12, when you get to be my age, it's hard to tell, we had a short lived controversy over dangerous bars. The idea was that manufacturers were making dangerous control bars because when smaller pilots with smaller bones crash, their bones broke before the down tubes did. Today, most of the complaints I hear are from the other side. Pilots who would rather have stronger down tubes, even if their bones break before the down tubes, because they're tired of buying $65 down tubes, which they're doing with some regularity. I have a different suggestion for both of these problems. Why don't we just stop crashing? Of course, I know why. The first reason is we don't even recognize it as crashing. I continually hear from pilots who say they broke a down tube on landing. I even hear from pilots who tell me with a straight face, I swear, that they broke a keel or a leading edge on landing. The second reason is we don't think it's possible to fly without breaking down tubes from time to time. I mean, after all, sometimes you're coming into land and the wind switches or the thermal breaks off, or you're trying to squeak it into that small field, and you can't help flaring with the wing down, sticking the leading edge, ground looping, slamming the nose, whack, and breaking a down tube. We regularly observe our fellow pilots breaking down tubes, which also reinforces our perception that this is normal. I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to say that if you've broken more than one down tube in the last 5 years of flying, you're doing something seriously and fundamentally wrong. Either you're flying too hot a glider for your skill, or you're flying in too challenging conditions, or at too difficult a flying site. Now let's ask one more thing. If hang glider pilots stop dying and the hang gliding landing areas stop resounding with the sound of whack every second or third landings, in other words, if hang gliding started looking like fun instead of looking both terrifying and deadly, do you think maybe the public's perception of the sport might change? Do you think more of them want to do it? In truth, no, they probably still wouldn't. But do you think they'd maybe stop thinking we're crazy for doing it? Maybe they would, and maybe they'd be right. Bye.